And we are live. Hello, folks. I'm back again with another installment talking about the urban mystic. And I had some technical challenges a while ago. My wife is an astrologer and not a woo-woo cosmic budgie kind of astrology, but quite a serious student of Hellenistic astrology. And in that tradition, they would say that such problems occur when Mercury is in retrograde, which actually, if we understand archetypes and patterning, it's a lot less silly than it sounds. Now, I was hoping some folks that were in the call before would join back. I've unfortunately made a hash of things with my technical problems. But I'm talking about this ongoing arc, and I'll be talking about this for the next, let's call it 14 days, because I do these in 20-day arcs. And the previous one was about finding voice. This archetypal vocation of finding our way to speak in the world, to enter a state of flow at will. Who doesn't want to enter a state of flow at will? We're all communicators, and that means these tiny, hello, Simon Drew, let's go, let's do it. Yes. All of these tiny interactions that we get in all of our relationships that ostensibly mean so much to us, we get these tiny windows of opportunity in which we can transmit something of profound meaning and importance and communicate something of solidarity, of love, of curiosity, of interest, of contention, whatever it is. But we always want to do that in the most effective way possible. Who doesn't want to be an effective communicator? The project of finding voice that I was focusing on before is exactly about that. It's about being able to access flow at will. It's being able to find our archetypal voice, our true, authentic way of speaking, our true, authentic inhabitation of our sense of where we're speaking from and who we're speaking to, that directionality. Our courage to be seen in that, and then to have our work criticized, whether as artists or as poets or as public thinkers or even leaders in our relationships. And then developing an intimate love affair, romance with our own forms of creative intellect, our own forms of genius. Nice to have you here, Simon. A very good friend of mine, Simon, is on the call. And nobody else is, just the two of us, Simon, just the two of us, in the immortal words of Will Smith. But this talking arc, that concluded now, and this talking arc, I'm speaking about another vocation that I have, which is the plight of the urban mystic. What is an urban mystic? A mystic is somebody who is deeply devoted, whether they recognize that word devoted or not. They're deeply engaged in some profound form of seeking or searching or reaching towards something, some state, some arrival at a belonging, some arrival at a knowing, some seeing and to see something and to be seen, to witness and to be witnessed, to touch and be touched by something, most especially that's not available in the context of our ordinary lives and in the ordinary world, the obvious world. That's what a mystic is. And in our traditional contexts, our stories, the mystic is always someone that either retreats to the life of an anchorite, or they live in a cell, or they're a hermit, or they're a pilgrim, or they're a sage out on the edge of the world, or they're some sort of seer and boundary dweller that lives on the edge. And in many of us that resonate with that sense of calling feel that way anyway, and yet we're still trying to pursue that interest, that calling in the context of our everyday lives here in, let's call it, an urban context. So that's to me what an urban mystic is. Hello, Gary. Fractal Universe, thanks for your help before. Oh gosh, I'm having some technical challenges. It's because my wife would say that Mercury is in retrograde. So now we know what an urban mystic is. And I'm giving myself these 20-day arcs to talk about it. And the topics that I've covered up until now, and I strongly, if this resonates with you, let me just go see what I've written in the past. There's about 5 topics that I've discussed already. Oh gosh, we do not want that one live. Oh gosh, sorry folks. The internet is doing me a disservice here. I don't know how to fix it. 1 second. I'm trying to talk about the previous entries that I put towards the Urban Mystic Talk track. So the last one I did yesterday was the power and the paradox of self-permission. Where do we get this sense of self-permission to transcend the voices and the opinions and the rule structures that we inherit in our lives growing up from society, from our parents? Like if you're going through a divorce or if you're going through like a separation from your previous identity, either career-wise or you're entering into a new philosophical arc of your life, you have to shed the identity of your previous self and step forward towards something else. And usually that requires transcending the permission structures that came with that previous identity. And the paradox is we can see how necessary it is to transcend that, but it becomes very difficult to give ourselves the permission to do so because we live with the question, on what basis are we giving ourselves permission to do so? And we're used to operating within a framework of permission, of say so, whether that's morals or ethics or just our sense of civic duty. Now, there's many ways of encoding that, but we always find that if we're on a true journey, we at some point are going to encounter the limits of these frameworks and we have to go our own way. So that's what we spoke about yesterday. Before that, we spoke about what it means to be a high agency human being and what the critical upgrade path of that is. So there's a series of these talks. They're quite long, but I believe they're very, very worthwhile investments. Today, what I'm talking about is the question of ego. We have so much misunderstanding about what ego is. And for the longest time, the spiritual community and the New Age community, a big part of that entire project and the masculine personal development and the whole project of personal development was very, very centered on this idea of killing the ego or transcending the ego or being, getting rid of the ego. And that created a lot of misunderstanding for people. Even today, the vast majority, the common denominator of people who are talking about such topics are talking about that project from a place of ignorance. Who have we got here? We've got Simon, we've got Fractal Universe back, and we've got Gary joined. Gentlemen, it's a sausage fest in here at the minute. That's okay. So, what is the ego and why is it necessary? And why can we not just kill the ego? Stephen Strickland, nice to have you here. Ego makes people so defensive. Yes. But I'm here to articulate and argue the case that ego is not just something to kill. It's actually something that is profoundly necessary to the evolutionary arc of the soul. How can that be? At the end of the day, we're all part of a process. Life is a process. Being a human being is a process. Living in the world right now is a process. And it's almost like we're all part of a tree that's busy growing. And the whole cosmos and the whole of Earth and the whole of human history is all the preceding cells and the trunk and the branches and the finer branches and eventually the twigs and then the leaves of the branch. And they're at the very, very edge where the cells are dividing and there's this crowning happening at the very end of, even in biology, something that is growing out in that sense, like the antler of a deer or the branch on a tree, is technically called a process. That little structure is called a process. And in that state, we cannot say that each individual leaf is permanent or each individual cell or each individual branch is somehow definitive and unique or definitive in a way that it's individual, that it can just stand apart and be this whole self. But it also, in this whole web of relative context, if you look at a tree or a plant, every little bit of that process is necessary and is seminal to what will flow on afterwards and become of it. Now, not everything stays on the tree. Some bits fall off and become compost. Some seeds fall off and become new trees, and some trees create lots of nuts or acorns and then go on to create an entire forest. That is the signature of emergence. But how we individually participate in that emergence is from having a single coherent perspective, a sense of a subjective self. If we didn't have that sense of a subjective self, that's all that ego means is I, right? There is a way of looking at this entire project of spiritual evolution or the meaning of life in the following way. I will often teach in an archetypal context that what the entire project of creation in every direction, upstream and downstream, as far as we can understand, perceive, reason, and relate to, that entire process is the process of whatever kicked this off. Let's call it God, let's call it the great intentionality, the great secret, this whatever. In the process of pursuing, asking, and answering incrementally, progressively, the question, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Isn't at the heart of all of our most profound spiritual inquiry. And if we look at the non-dual projects, Buddhism, some of the teachings of the yogic schools, of Advaita Vedanta, of Dzogchen, of Zen even, much of that is playing with this tension of asking, who am I, but also surrendering to the entire process of being, which is so much larger than the individual I. But if the process is the evolution of the spirit and the evolution of the soul, in this pursuit of this calling, what we call archetypally desire, then, we'll get to that in a second, then the ego is profoundly necessary, because we can't participate meaningfully as everything, as just washed into the great ocean of everything, and I'm just the river that surrendered itself into the ocean. To do that is to no longer be a self, and to do that is to no longer participate in the unfolding. It's to surrender back into the ocean of consciousness and of being, in which there is no need for representation or participation as an individual participant. We make the mistake so often to think that the way that we are participating is bad or wrong. And because it carries so much risk, every single person here is becoming something day by day. The entire process is unfolding day by day. The reality that we're experiencing in the world as our modern situation in 2026 is all the result of upstream choices and causes and interactions that humans made with their environment. We have shaped our reality. Human beings created the internet. Human beings create the content that deranges us on the internet. Human beings subscribe to the game of politics and to the game of capitalism and to the game of Western democracy and to these games of nations and religions, etc. We are creating the unfolding reality to a point. Let's read some comments. Fractal Universe says ego makes people so defensive. Yes, but ego also makes people make statements like that, wherein we're judgmental of other people being defensive, right? That's also ego. It's how we participate. It's how we discern. It's how we judge from our relative perspective. It's how we operate. The entire universe is a single process that supports this expression, this experience as an individual, relatively. And space and time is just a way of expressing infinite unity in the context of finitude. That's why things are broken up between here and there, between now and later. So space-time is also quantized in a way to create a topology from which each individual can experience the process relative to their position in space and in time and in their conscious evolution, right? So that we can contribute and participate and make ripples and be part of the great unfolding. Fractal Universe says ego is a narrative buffer. It is a necessary narrative buffer without which we couldn't participate meaningfully, because if you have too wide a context or a universal context, right, the context of an individual having an experience would very quickly become utterly meaningless. And I wrote about that in an essay, a short one called The Road Ahead, and I might read that later. Gary says ego is an evolutionary interface that provides the subject frame with which we partake of the cosmic happening. Yes. And Fractal Universe says, I have a different definition of ego and just trying to explain it is usually misunderstood. Yes, it is usually misunderstood, and I agree. And the fact that you have a different definition of ego is demonstration of my point. There is actually a function to ego. If there wasn't a function to ego, ego would not exist. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to triangulate on that function of ego based on our understanding of universal principles and of archetype and of higher orders of topology and ordering principles, etc. And the fact that you're expressing your version is exactly my point. Somewhere beyond your version and my version is the truth about what an ego is. And if we try this idea that I'm expressing on for size, I think it reconciles both our opinions, but also starts shining the light not only onto what the ego is, but also why it's necessary, and that can then therefore illuminate how we go about this process of the alchemizing of that ego, of the transforming of that ego into something robust, resilient. We don't want to kill it, we want to make it healthy. We don't want to shush it and shame it. We want to acknowledge its function. To do that means we're actually living in harmony with the greater patterning and the greater design. That's my interpretation. And I invite you to try it on for size. So this really points to why ego is necessary, because without the ego, or without even recognizing the ego and recognizing its necessity, we can very quickly become caught in projects that we think are transcendent of ego, but exactly serving the ego. Let me give you an example. In our desire to be free of the torments of the ego, we latch onto a framework or a spiritual system, or we devise our own. And whether that yields the results that we expect, what does the expecting? It's the ego that does the expecting, right? And we think we are disenfranchising the ego by not recognizing the sovereignty of our selfhood, right? By being confused about that in some sense, by trying to be too spiritual or too virtuous in something. The desire that wants to be spiritual and virtuous is the ego, right? The one in self that can use the ego in a healthy, robust, meaningful way is not desiring of virtuousness, is not desiring of spirituality. They just want to be whole and to be home. And to be whole, we must be individual. Individual, which means the ego is part and parcel of this embodied, ensouled experience. And the only way to feel more whole is to integrate it. And the integration of that is not one and done. If you look at the Nautilus shell, this thing that expands forever. Let me bring up an image. Here's some beautiful images of the Nautilus shell cut in half. Here's a great one. Is this a good one? Here's a good one. Yeah. Oh God, I think I can find a decent image now. The internet's just become so painful, hasn't it? There we go. This is a good one. That'll do. I'll share my screen very quickly. You tell me if you can see that. Right. There is room in here for iteration and growth. Actualization and integration, actualization and integration, actualization and integration. And you can see, as with the golden spiral, there's no necessity for that spiral to end. There's no necessity for that spiral to end. Fractal Universe says, I have it mathematically derived from 4 axioms that build into a lot of similar equations of mainstream physics. It's elegant. Life is a spiral. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So every time we evolve, in some sense, I've got an axiom for you. Everything that is real casts a shadow. That is a aphoristic way of saying everything that is created or manifested or brought into being, our way of living, of embodying this process, brings into being new versions of ourselves. We have seasonality. And as we move through these seasons and these arcs and these chapters of our life, a new version of ourselves is brought into being. That's the whole point of the evolution of the soul, right? That is spoken about in astrology. And as we're evolving, we become greater. We develop greater forms of agency. Humanity in 2026 has inherited demigod-like agency in the world. Demigod-like agency. The things that we can do with our technology now enable us to change our platform, our ecosystem, our environment, our reality in profound ways. Now, the patterning of this process doesn't tolerate everything and anything. If you remember that Nautilus shell, it has to subscribe to a certain patterning, even though there is an infinite number of steps that can ultimately be reached. Each step must be done in proportion to the previous step. That's the golden section, 1 to 1.6. There's a ratio between how much you can grow in the next phase based on how much you've integrated in the past. So that relationship, and as Fractal Universe says, life is a spiral, and that's why our forms of expression are not just spirals. They're spirals that are segmented by these iterations of actualization and integration. And so as we are becoming something real, everything that is made real in the world will cast some kind of a shadow. Things emerge into existence in pairs, an expression and a shadow expression, a visible and an invisible, a known and an unknown part. And the reason that our evolution is incremental is to give us time to catch our breath. People will say that the model of Plato's cave is that's it. We're all stuck in a cave of ignorance, and our job is to spelunk our way out of this cave into the great world of forms and truth. My argument is that it's caves all the way up, caves all the way up. And every single new cave of expansion that we spelunk into has a new kind of Plato's cave game that we need to transcend and understand the bigger paradigm, understand the bigger narrative, understand the bigger context, and develop a greater sense of self that is equal to that journey. And so every single time we evolve, our ego needs to come with for the ride, or what we're doing is not really evolving. We are leaning too far over our skis. We are setting ourselves up for some kind of precipitous collapse or crash, wherein we meet with reality at terminal velocity and all our illusions shatter apart on impact. In that sense, the ego becomes profoundly necessary. And the job is not to kill the ego or to damn it or to blame it as the thing that makes people defensive. Ego is also the thing that makes people noble. Ego is also the thing that makes people reserved or quiet. It is the way that the self coheres and operates as a self in the context of trying to navigate the unfolding moment in order to get its deepest needs met. The deepest needs at a fundamental Maslowian sense, but also in this aspirational sense of achieving our forms of actualization. And it's mapped so beautifully in the model of the chakras. You don't have to believe in burning spheres of light inside your body, but it's easy to understand that there's multiple ways in which consciousness is as a mind, body, psyche, spirit, complex, there is not just one way in which I parse and relate to my conscious experience. And if you look at the chakras, it's just a way to map the different ways in which we can relate to different forms of conscious experience. And so, at the root is the red chakra. That's tied to our indelible connection with life. We are, in Kabbalistic archetypal terms, trembling beings. We are afraid of death necessarily because a mortal death to the ego represents an end to the immediate form of participation that it's engaged in, and it maybe feels that it hasn't reached its fulfillment in the arc of this life. We want to stay alive. It's also necessary for us to stay alive so that, because the body of a human being is the mechanism by which new bodies can become ensouled and new participants can participate in life. If we all became enlightened and had no ego, in some sense, what would be the need for us to follow our base bodily procreation functions? And we wouldn't have children, we wouldn't want to raise them, we wouldn't want to do anything industrious in this world. We would all just be zenning and blissing out. Right. That would end the human project, ultimately. And so that kind of ego of the body, of the root chakra, and the whole lower experience as mapped by the chakras is profoundly necessary for the continuation of life. It's in the absence of our knowledge of how to manage that, a necessary protocol or operating system by which we can look after that adequately. That's the cause of our malaise, not the fact that we have a lower animal experience, but the fact that we don't know how to become the human masters of that lower experience, honoring the body, honoring those shadow expressions, and bringing what is in shadow up into the light through the medium of the heart, right? That's the project. However well or badly it's been described to you up until now, that's the understanding I'm offering. The next one up is the sacral, the sex region. Our sex is so fundamentally tied psychologically to our sense of identity in the world. Our ability to create, our ability to gestate things, our ability to penetrate and to receive, archetypally speaking, is centered there. It's a different form of experience, and it's to do with our embodiment, our ensoulment in this world. The next one up from that is our gut, our center of nurturing, the place of the inner child, our interface with the world. Our stomach is an interface with the world, and we become what we eat. In fact, our gut flora is non-human. A large percentage of our gut flora is non-human. And so we are absolutely creatures of the environment that we live in. And all of this lower function is intended to be mediated by the heart. I'll often say that the most sensitive instrument in the universe is the awakening human heart. The heart is a feeling instrument, and it's so sensitive, and it's the only place in which we can moderate our upper desire and our lower desire. What is our upper desire? This is now the throat chakra, which is all about our forms of expression, our stance, how we articulate ourselves in the world. Let's listen to the word articulate. Articulate means taking things together and joining them in such a way that they are able to do something, like tools. Tools are articulated, right? It's a form of engineering, right? Engineering coherence. And then another form of our conscious expression is our intellect, our mind. Some of the non-dual traditions will tell you mind is the enemy. In the Hermetic Western tradition, mind is not the enemy. It's another faculty that we have to master, which has higher forms of expression. Fractal Universe says, I want to go work on my work now, and we all see our own subjective reality built from our past stacked on top of itself over and over. Yes, we do. Our identity is our most manipulative aspect as it's installed, and we control ourselves. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. But identity is not permanent, and identity needs to be shed and transcended every time we make those little incremental clicks of the Nautilus shell. Every time we branch and fork in terms of our own process as a tree that is growing and bearing fruit and going through its own seasonality. The the tree has something authentic which becomes shaped over years of many winters and many summers and many fires and many sheddings, right? But it also has an identity in that season that lasts for that season and then has to be surrendered at the end of that season. So if we think of wheat that grows tall in the sun, eventually it starts off as a little seedling that's abandoned somehow, right? We get this sense of abandonment in our lives. And then we get swallowed up by the earth, and the earth becomes a new womb. And that becomes the safe respite. And then eventually something calls to that seed, calls to ourselves, our souls, and we split apart, we break open, right? The first act of the awakening human heart and the seed alike is breaking open, splitting apart and breaking open. And the intentionality, the desire is so strong to make for the surface, to make for the light. But if we mean to actually grow tall in the sun, the first thing we actually have to do is put a small little tentative taproot down to anchor ourselves into life and into the world. And James Hillman used to say the aim is not to reach for the divine, but to grow down more deeply into life. And eventually, with that anchoring that we have to break through even this womb of the earth that has held us in safe darkness. And we have to emerge with this little tender shoot out into the light and vie next to all the other sheaves of wheat for our chance to stand tall in the sun. And we mature and we weather winds and rain and hot sun and all sorts of seasons. And eventually, at the crowning moment of our maturity in that identity, we're all cut down. We're all cut down and we tell ourselves that something terrible has occurred. And then we're abandoned in a barn. And at least we think to ourselves, this is the end. This is the great rest. And then we're taken and we're threshed. And then we think this threshing is the end. And the threshing is there to release the husk, what is now no longer necessary, but it doesn't come free easily. It's not like this liberation of angel choirs and a shaft of light from heaven. It's a painful experience, this threshing, as we go across the threshold. And then we think, this is now the end, right? And that releases the kernel, and the kernel is liberated. This is now the true truth of ourselves beyond the husk of impermanent ego identity, right? But then eventually that kernel is then either ground into flour and it thinks that's the end, and then it's kneaded into bread and it thinks that's the end, then it's baked into the oven and it thinks that's the end, but it's all part of life. Simon says you've got a student and you have to go. No worries. Cheers, Simon. Thanks for joining. Fractal Universe says, yep, you've been spot on all these live talks. Caught a great job, bud. Okay, excellent. And Gary says, mind is the Buddha. Buddha is just an identity. It's a very large identity, but it's still an identity. And if we had to find ourselves marooned in a spaceship with no record of our history and stranded on some new planet, right, we will be able to find the truths that the Buddha pointed to without any knowledge of the Buddha or their history on planet Earth. Buddhism is a human project, and the Buddha is a human idea. These are all human ideas, and they all have transience to them, even though they point to something more permanent. No, there's a difference between the Buddha, the being, and Buddha, the ontological principle. Yes, but that's going to need explained because there isn't clarity about that. And we don't understand easily the difference between the pointer at something and the something that it points to. Language, even mathematics, our highest forms of expression are not the thing. They're just our notations of the thing. So until we can make those kinds of distinctions, we're going to be stuck making these kinds of critiques and misunderstanding each other. So really, what this talk was about today was explaining why the ego is necessary, and the ego is a sense of self that has evolved part and parcel with this process. And what it does is it allows a sense of being an individual, a sense of how the greater sense of being is parsed and divvied up into trillions of points of experience. that are arriving and evolving and changing and shedding and being cut down and being threshed and being seeded and being swallowed up by the earth and then coming out. The entire thing is an enormous process. There is a sense of peace that we can get when we realize that's the bigger thing. And the forms of threshing, the forms of identity death, the forms of great trial and unbecoming, unraveling that we endure are not to destroy our sense of self altogether. They to remind us that our deeper form of self is something that is transcendent, is something that is more perennial, is something that is whole, is what we want to call God or Buddha. It's this higher sense of self that we can fundamentally cohere and align and become co-equal with over time as we put the ego back in its rightful place. Now, for some people, that invitation is to release that burden of ego altogether, but not everybody has that dharma. Some people have the dharma where they want to alchemize the ego, they want to mature it, they want to make it more resilient, make it a good servant. I'm Rocco. That is an ego thing. But when I think of Rocco, I like that guy. I like his intentionality. I like the way he shows up in the world. He's a servant to what he believes in. Right. That's how I see myself. But I don't see that's the whole of me. I see that's the temporary me in this expression, but I'm here now. I'm here now living this expression. And guess what? I've got this height. I've got this color eyes. I've got this DNA. I've got this stupid name. But I've also got this beautiful family, and I've got this chance at life and making a mark and making a ripple and leaving a legacy and taking as many across the threshold as I can during that time and making this place more beautiful. And I couldn't do that without an ego. I am not, if I search inside myself, I am not some kind of selfless guru or sage. I'm not a Jesus. I'm not a Buddha. There's a story that I'll leave you with. It's called the story of Zusha. He was a rabbinic teacher. So he was a teacher of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah and so on. And he was loved by all of his students. And on his deathbed, his students gathered around him to get his last teachings, because there was a belief that the closer that somebody is towards death, the closer they are towards God or Buddha or being. And he admitted to his students that he was afraid. And they said, "Oh, how can you be afraid, teacher? Because, who can say that you didn't teach us the examples of Moses or the wisdom of Solomon or the courage of David?" And he said, I'm not afraid that God will judge me for not being more like David or for not being more like Moses or for not being more like Solomon. I'm afraid God will say to me, "Zusha, why were you not more like Zusha?" And then he passes away. But even in his death, he provides vulnerability, an admission to his students, and a teaching all in one fell swoop, right? That's so brilliant and so genius. And whether that story is true or not, there is a truth in that we can all recognize, because the truth is transcendent to all identities and stories, just like the example of Zusha. We didn't come here. Not all of us. Some of us, I believe, 100%, like the yin yang. There is an element of human beings whose dharma, whose greatest desire is to be free of desire. They just do not want to be a self. They want to be liberated from that burden of selfhood, from that burden of ego, of participation. They want to surrender to the great ocean of being. Not everybody has that dharma. We've missed that. Some of us have a dharma where we have work to do in this world. We've got given purposes or senses of meaning, right, that want to live through us, gifts that want to live through us so that we can make the world a more beautiful place. Buddha's job as a human being was to transmit that download of wisdom. That's not the ultimate final download. That is a profoundly useful download about that project. But there are other projects. Buddhism doesn't in of itself explain how to be a horticulturist or how to engineer a bridge or how to make safe AI. It alludes to these things, but there are other callings in the world that are more tailored and more specific, right, to all sorts of necessary things. And here we are in 2026 in the face of all of this complexity and all of this suffering. And we know that Buddhism is not the final answer on this, that the non-dual project is not the final answer because if pursued fully, it would end the human project. And I have a calling not to end the human project. I have a calling to make the human project more beautiful, less suffering, and more meaningful, so that more people can come through and enjoy the beauty of Buddhism and of non-dualism and of Advaita Vedanta and of all the other arts and crafts and callings that we can unpack so beautifully through ourselves. So the aim of this talk was to explain why ego is so profoundly necessary for that. And the invitation therein is to then look at and say, it's not that we have to jettison the ego or kill the ego. What we have to do is we have to heal and train and tame the ego and bring it into alignment. And the only thing that can do that is a sense of self that has the authority to do that is large enough to contain that project, that is gracious enough, that can hold space for that grace, that can align itself with duty. And I mean a dharmic sense of duty, not a virtuous sense of duty. And answering ourselves, what does love look like to me right now? That means I have to be a me still. What is most beautiful to my soul? I have to recognize that my soul is individual from other souls, that I have something that wants to speak through me, right? That is perilously close to the idea of ego, but it doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be a shadow expression. It doesn't have to be this craven, covetous thing that finds the answer to everything is more, or domination, or domineering, or shit-canning other people, or gnawing grievances, right? There is a different way. There is a different way to be. All right. So that's my contribution to meaning today. And if there's any further comments or questions, I'm happy to field them. And I argued with people today. I disagreed with people today. I set them straight according to what I believe is most relevant and necessary. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but this is the information I would have wanted to know when I was on my journey. I would have wanted a different perspective of clarity that could widen the project for me. So this is what love looks like to me now. This is what is most beautiful to my soul. What would be most beautiful to my soul is if thousands of people were engaging with this and were finding a sense of self-empowerment and ridding themselves of this terrible sickness of hating on themselves because they can't hate their ego or into some form of disappearance or submission. We're at war with ourselves, and this doesn't have to be a war. It can become a game. Ladies and gentlemen, unless there's any comments or questions, I'm super happy to field questions. But if we're all saturated with me jabbering on, I'll just bid you all a beautiful good evening and I'll be on my way. I'll keep watching the chat to see if anyone has anything to contribute. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for holding space for this conversation. And if you're interested in these kind of topics, there are previous videos that I've put together which all build on each other towards a thesis about what it means to be an urban mystic and all of the questions we need to live with in the context of how do we live a life of great flourishing that they described in eudaimonia, and how do we reach forward to become something that we are called to become, right, whilst practicing this subtle art of being as well, right? How do we do these things, which is called entelekaya? How do we embody these things and practice them, right, in a more sophisticated way in a modern context? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a beautiful evening and take care. I'll see you here in a couple of days.